Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Mark and TJ tipped me off to a story. We've seen this before, and that is where somebody builds a house in the wrong spot, and occasionally the authorities will come by and go, hey, your house needs to be moved over a foot. Of course, you can't move the typical house 1 foot that easily, and so quite often these houses get torn down. So from KOMU and KMOV, Gabriella Vidal wrote the story. New Kirkwood home torn down in the middle of construction after a small mistake puts the property in violation of city code. Kirkwood home in the middle of development was torn down this week because during the process, the property was built 1 foot too close to the property line. It wasn't beyond the property line. It was on the correct property. It was too close to the setback. And the city would not forgive that mistake. Katie Berry of the St. Louis Realtors, she's the president, said, there's no such thing as building anything without some hiccups, so building an entire house is certainly going to be no exception, and some things are always going to come up. Of course, this is a big thing. Berry says the demand for homes in the metro region and in high-demand areas like Kirkwood has pushed an increasing number of buyers to build new housing. A huge demand for houses, multiple offer situations, and houses going significantly above list price make this a really hard time to be a buyer. So one buyer did not expect the headache he got after purchasing his new home on South Harrison Avenue, but that was before it was developed. Bruce Bartlett says, my client is a reputable builder that's been around for 30 years, and he's going to do what is necessary to make sure his client gets the product they want, and that's what his goal is right now. He's the attorney representing the development company in charge of building this home. He says, we had all the permits necessary. We went through the building process as normal. Kirkwood's setback requirement for homes is they cannot be built less than 5 feet away from a neighboring property line. So you got to build on your property and leave a 5-foot buffer. The city tells News 4 the house ended up being built 1.6 feet over that required structure setback line on the north end, meaning there's only 3.4 feet between the home and the property line. So it was inside the property, 3.4 feet, but needed to be 5 feet. Bartlett says it was not until the foundation had been poured and work on building the frame began that a survey identified the home was in violation of the city's code. And this is one you do wonder about, because there are people who are in charge of these things, and some of the most obvious things are setbacks. You know, I understand that somebody might miss something in the wiring with the code in the electrical, because not everyone's going to immediately spot electrical issues. But the house, everyone knows that the house has got to be built, in a certain place with certain setbacks. But still, we hear about this stuff all the time. So Kirkwood's setback requirement for homes is they cannot be built less than 5 feet away from a neighboring property line. The city tells the TV station the house ended up being 1.6 feet over and therefore was only 3.4 feet away. So we immediately notified the city of the fact that it was built in a setback, and that was when the problem was first determined. So they contacted the city and said, look, can we leave this here? The developer met with the city's Board of Adjustments for a hearing. The developer requested a variance be granted on the site to continue building. The request was denied on a 3-2 vote. Despite support from the home buyer and a neighbor to the property, and even some members on the board in favor of letting construction continue. So Bartlett says, and we also had the neighbor come in and testify that he preferred the structure to stay even with the encroachment into the setback. And keep in mind, this isn't an encroachment over a property line, it's an encroachment over a setback, so we were still on our property. So apparently the neighbor, who you think would be the one most likely to complain, actually said, I don't care. I don't care. And 2 of the people on the panel said, we don't care either, but 3 said they did. So a member of the board questioned the hardship this could bring to neighbors now that a construction would have to start over. But another member says a violation is a violation. We've got to make sure the builders understand there is a price to pay, said one board member. That neighborhood has totally changed. That's not a bad thing. I'm not saying that, but it's what it is. And change is inevitable. And I don't have a problem with the change, but please adhere to the law. And that's what we're talking about. The ordinances are law. News 4 reached out to the city about the property and the board's decision to not deny the request for variance, and got this. The board denied the variance on the basis that a mistake by the builder is not adequate justification for variance. At that point, the builder had to evaluate whether the house could have been altered or moved to come into compliance, but ultimately determined that demolition was their best option. When building anything in the city, builders submit plans for review and are required to build according to the approved plans. The city then conducts various inspections throughout the building process to verify compliance. However, it is the builder's responsibility to build according to the approved plans and in compliance with the codes. At the time this property was initially being built, there was no requirement for a builder to do a foundation boundary survey before moving forward with construction. But as of December 2021, the city started requiring that survey be done to prevent mistakes like this from recurring. So that is another thing. And I've used this example before, and I've talked about this, that there are different racing circuits around the world. And when you race in a particular class of cars, they will inspect the cars to make sure they meet the guidelines. So NASCAR is famous for having people who check the cars to make sure they comport with NASCAR rules. And if they catch a car that's illegal before a race, they might penalize you, but they'll certainly make you fix it before you race it. If they catch a car that's illegal after a race, they'll penalize you, and they also could disqualify and do other things. It's a question of whether they do that or not. But there have been situations before where somebody had a car that had passed a bunch of inspections, and then shortly before the race, an inspector came by and goes, "Hey, turns out that's illegal right there. Fix it." And it's so close to race time, they haven't got time to fix it, or they do fix it. They're rushing around trying to fix something. And I remember reading an article years ago about this, and it had to do with the placement, I believe, of an oil cooler and how close the oil cooler was to other things inside the engine compartment and so on, various places where you hide an oil cooler. And at one point in time, the owner of the car said, "This is crazy because this passed inspection. And for them to tell us this now is not fair." Somebody went and found the official and said, "What's the story?" And he goes, "It's not my job to catch you. It's your job to follow the rules." That's all there is to it. So the interesting thing is that everyone knows in the building process, you submit plans, and between when the plans are submitted and when the house is finished, there are a bunch of interim inspections done. And the inspections are done, they do an inspection, they go, "Okay, now you can proceed with the next set of work." And they do that because there's some things that are easier to inspect before the house is completely done. However, the mere fact that you passed an inspection does not necessarily mean that you've complied with all the rules and regulations. And so the problem here is that they didn't do an inspection immediately upon pouring the foundation. They did an inspection somewhat later. And it looks like the builder caught this themselves and came forward with it, but that's not the point. The point is that if there had been an earlier inspection, somebody would have said, "Hey, this foundation actually needs to be about 3 feet this way," right? Or whatever it is, 1.5 feet that way. So that's the problem. The question always is this the solution? And I kind of see the point. Because let's suppose that you built this house and it's out of bounds with respect to regulations. And the one neighbor that it encroaches upon says, "I'm cool with that." Okay? That still does change the nature of the neighborhood, which is what one of those people on the board is getting at. So you drive through the neighborhood and you're checking out the neighborhood. One of the things you do notice is how close the houses are together. And so you might be driving through there and you go, "Wow, those houses are packed so close. Look at that. Look at those ones. They're only a couple feet apart." And it does change the nature of the neighborhood. But again, the question is, is this harsh result the way to go? So it's a crazy story. It looks like the builder's making good on it, which is the good thing. So I can imagine in some other situations where a builder might go, "Gee, it's going to cost a lot of money. You know something? I might fold up this LLC and go down the road and start another one." So Mark and TJ, thanks for sending it. New Kirkwood home torn down in the middle of construction after a small mistake puts the property in violation of the city code, literally by a matter of inches. KOMU and KMOV ran it. Gabriella Vidal wrote it. And I mentioned this yesterday. I'll mention it one more time. I get asked quite often lately about whether or not I could make these videos available as a podcast. And ironically, they are. They've been available as a podcast since before I was making videos. I started making a podcast. So if you go to iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Podbean, Google Play, any place that they have podcasts, Lehto's Law is there. Look up Lehto's Law, Lehtos Law, Lehto's Law. Look up Lehto's Law and you'll see the podcast, the audio version of these videos on the podcast. And just so you know, there's no advertising there. So advertising on YouTube, but not on the podcast. So if you want to go someplace where you can sit there and literally just have them play in order, that's what will happen. And by the way, a lot of videos that I take down because they don't have enough views or whatever, I leave the podcasts up on iTunes. So there's actually more podcasts on iTunes than there are videos on YouTube of mine. So there you go. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. If wishes were dishes, we'd have a full set.